Hi. Hello everyone, welcome to Comms. This session is called End-to-End DLP in Microsoft 365 and will be presented to you by Steve Goodman. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you and good morning, everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful Comms. I'm Steve Goodman. I work at a partner in the UK called Content and Code, part of the Content and Cloud group, where we're very, very focused on Microsoft Cloud, and in particular, the part of the company I work for is very focused on Microsoft 365. And myself, I've been working across the suite for a long time, around 21 years working in the industry now, Active Directory for 18 of those and Exchange for 18, 19 years as well. And even today, still a focus on Microsoft Exchange, as well as some of the newer technologies like Teams and underlying stuff like identity and security as well. I've previously spoken at events like Ignite, and if you like podcasts, then be sure to tune into the All About 365 podcast, which I host every couple of weeks with fellow MVP Jason Wynn, or join me on the weekly Practical 365 podcast with Siggy Jagot, where we talk through all of the latest news and announcements in the world of Microsoft 365, and usually get people on to talk from the product groups about what the new feature is and how it might affect your environment. I also write for and chief editor of practical365.com, which is a big site for Office 365 news and updates and practical hands-on knowledge for getting under the hood and doing some of this stuff. And I also write for one of the sites, petri.com as well. You can follow me on Twitter at Steve Goodman to find out more about what I like to talk about online. As Anoop said, in today's session, we're going to be talking about end-to-end DLP with Microsoft 365, in particular, of course, Microsoft Teams. And although we can use the full suite of Microsoft information protection to protect lots of our sensitive or confidential information and make sure that it is all encrypted and secure, a lot of organizations do want to try and make sure that all of their data, whether it is sensitive content or not, is secured really at that boundary. And that's what we're going to be talking mostly about in this session today. You know, what are your options if you don't want to protect all of your data? You don't want everything encrypted in the cloud, and you just want to try and make sure that DLP means to your business that content is protected at those borders. So we'll have a look at some of the key fundamentals for that, including the data loss prevention functionality in Microsoft 365, and also how we can protect our borders with Azure AD, Conditional Access, and how we can use Microsoft Cloud App Security with that to provide additional protection. And we'll also have a look at how we protect the endpoints as well, particularly mobile devices and what we've got on offer inside our Windows information protection policies as well. So how can data be lost from an organization? We've got Sally in the middle who uses Teams on a day-to-day basis. And as many of you, if you're at Commonwealth, will probably know, Teams relies on a lot of other services, and you'll probably use Teams alongside other stuff as well. Teams is where you might chat and collaborate with your colleagues, but your data, your files will most likely be stored in OneDrive or SharePoint. That's where you'll be working on documents together, getting stuff done, and potentially sharing with people outside of the organization. And of course, in email, you'll use that, first of all, as the back end for a lot of things in Office 365 groups like compliance, but people will still work on a document together, get that stuff done inside Teams, but then email out that document or a link to it using those traditional methods, because not everybody is using Microsoft Teams just yet, just most people. So we've got that external sharing vector where people can send information out from our tenant into the Wild West. Who knows where that's going? And we need to try and protect against that. But also we need to try and protect against how data can be shared internally as well. We can lose data between the wrong teams or accidentally expose data to the wrong people as well. You know, for example, if you accidentally overshare data with people outside of your finance team, like the payroll list, everybody's salaries, then that's obviously not something that most organizations want to do. And in this new world where people are logging in from their own devices, they're logging in from home, we also need to be conscious that there's other areas that people are going to be accessing the environment from. We might be expecting people to access from their own devices. They might be logging in from their own personal devices, whether that is a web browser or their PC at home or their own personal mobile devices as well. And if you've been reading some of the press, you will have seen the services like social media services, I won't name any names, where they do have some techniques that they're using, where they're grabbing things like the clipboard on a regular basis to try and bring that data in and analyze it. Some of that might not be nefarious, but it might be that you don't want that confidential information to leak out of the business into other places. And managed devices as well can be another area where data can be lost, because if you are using fairly lightweight management on the devices, or they're outside of the organization's control, people are working from home, maybe they are allowed to access the internet through their home Wi-Fi connection, then that's another area where somebody might take a file that isn't protected and share that externally. And what we want to do is try and make sure that we're covering all of our bases. So we're not overprotecting all of the data in the service, but we're protecting just enough. So first of all, let's have a look at how we can protect data with Office 365 DLP. So data loss prevention in Office 365 has been around for, I think Exchange 2013 introduced the core functionality in that. So 7-8 years ago in the Office 365 service, and over time that's extended to other services as well. What it's going to help us protect against is loss via these two vectors on the left, where people are sharing data either externally, over email, over Teams, through OneDrive, through SharePoint, and also internally using those same methods, so sharing outside of that group, sharing the wrong sorts of data. And it's giving us that capability to be able to look at the data and decide whether something needs to be done to stop it being shared, regardless of whether the user has protected it or not. And this is included with most core licenses. So if you're an enterprise and you bought Office 365 E3 licenses, or you've got Microsoft 365 E3, then you'll get the core protection for Office 365. And that includes Exchange, OneDrive for Business, and SharePoint. And if you were using the E5 licenses, then you'll also get some additional capabilities in Office 365 E5 to protect against Teams. We've also got DLP functionalities, which I'll show you briefly, but it won't be the focus of this session, that come as part of EMS E5 as well. So within Office 365, we've got these core options. We've got, as I said, that core Exchange functionality, which a lot of this has really grew from where it had the capabilities back 8 years ago to be able to automatically detect when things were shared over email, both in the Outlook client, but also at transport time. Perhaps if you were connecting a mobile device using older technologies like ActiveSync, it could detect that mail in transit if you weren't running an enlightened client that could understand the rules that you'd apply. Several years ago, SharePoint and OneDrive also became part of that service as well. And SharePoint relies partly on the Office suite, which has that enlightened engine where it can apply those rules when you're saving files, but it also has that scheduled scanning service which can detect content that might be uploaded via something like OneDrive client on the desktop into the service, and it can scan and find that content as well. And more recently, we've got Teams chat and channel message protection using Office 365 DLP too. And what that gives us is the capabilities to stop people from sharing some of that sensitive information, those things like credit card numbers and so on, if they're being shared either internally or externally over chats or into channels. So if somebody does ask for something they shouldn't, it's sent over the wire, then it's got the capability to redact that information and stop that being shared widely as well, with very little user intervention, but showing the user what's happened. As part of this, we get some basic default built-in rules and templates that make this easy for us to configure. But we do need to understand how it all works, because sometimes these can overlap and sometimes they might not do exactly what we want. When we're configuring these, though, we do have the option to look for whether a document or message has a particular classification, whether it uses a particular sensitive information type, where it's being shared with as well. Is it being shared just internally? Is that what we're trying to protect against? Or is it just external sharing that we're concerned about? If it's going over email, who is the recipient? Is there certain domains that we need to allow or protect against? What should we do when we can't scan that information as well? So we've got those core set of things that we can do to look at the content, look at its classification. Primarily, though, we will rely on looking for particular sensitive information types, and I'll show you a little bit more about those in a bit. When those conditions are met, then we've got the options on what we can do, whether that is to block the message for the recipient, for everybody, just external users, who we notify, and who will send those alerts to if we need to make sure that a security or compliance team are aware of some sort of breach. And on the Exchange side, then we get some options which typically you will supplement with MIP today or AIP, where we might look to encrypt that content if it matches those conditions. So just to quickly show you what we'll expect to see in clients like Outlook is something called policy tips, and these have been in the client for a long time. So again, back to Office 2013, after that launched, it brought in these policy tips where it can look at the policies that apply to the user, and then an enlightened client like Outlook, if somebody attaches an attachment with that content or they type that into a message, then it can warn the user before that happens, and we can allow them to override it, report it as a false positive, and of course stop them from performing that action. Inside SharePoint itself, we've got core functionality that can protect against things like external sharing or internal sharing of documents as well. One of the more recent useful features that has came to SharePoint Online with DLP is the ability to block things like external sharing of documents until the file has been scanned, because sometimes it can take perhaps 24 hours for the scanning engine to get round. And if somebody drops that into an externally shared site in SharePoint Online, then what we will want to happen is make sure that that file is scanned before an external person can see it. And that's an option that if it works well for you, it's worth sharing. It's worth switching on, because it makes sure that people will go through that process to switch on those policies before they move ahead. So the automatic prevention options are here. So if we look on the left, we've got some of these that apply really to Outlook and Exchange only. And on the left-hand side, we've got low friction actions that will happen. And on the right-hand side, higher friction. So first of all, we've got pop-up warnings that are going to be sent when there's external content, which will be that mail tip that you saw. Then we can uplift that to encryption of particular messages in transit, and also adding additional protection on top of that. For example, stopping people sharing that content onward. When we're thinking about Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Microsoft Teams, then we've got the ability to block access to that content, allow the user to override that, which again is bringing back the friction a little bit, because it may be that perhaps they do need to share a particular bit of data with somebody internally. Perhaps a compliance team is asking for something from finance for an audit. Maybe they're allowed to override those kind of policies on occasion, write the justification so it can be reviewed. And then we've got the more difficult options for a user, where it will stop them from performing these actions at all, where they can't override the policies at all. So I'm going to quickly show you what this looks like in the service, how we configure it, and what the end result looks like. So this is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. So this has been, over the last 6 months or so, been revamped a lot to provide a lot of different and new functionality. So if you've not looked at this for some time, then take a look, because you'll see new functionality in here, like communication compliance, insider risk management tools, data subject access requests for responding to SARS that complements that core DLP and e-discovery functionality as well. One of the key things that we'll be able to use within the service is the ability to configure our sensitive information types. And the sensitive information types are really useful when it comes to DLP, because they are the core set of policies that will be used across both DLP, but within other services as well. For example, if we are using MIP, then being able to use sensitive information types will give us the ability to define once what our organization's data looks like. So this has moved in the new Compliance Center under data classification. And in this sensitive information types viewer, you'll see I've got a list of pre-built-in sensitive information types. The built-in sensitive information types cover a variety of common scenarios. So that might be personal information like UK passport number, United States social security number. It might be to do with healthcare, financial information as well. And these get grouped together in our templates for things like DLP, where we can then go and create a policy. And we can create our own custom information types as well. So many organizations will have particular formats for records that they keep. For example, customer account numbers. A bank might use account number and sort code, or it might be that you want to protect against perhaps long lists of personal information like names being shared as well. And within here, we can either use some of the built-in sensitive information types, or we can create our own. If we're creating our own type, then this is going to give us the ability to define what that looks like. So if I pick something like account number, and then we can pick the requirements for matching, and we can have a primary element and supporting element as well. And the primary element in an account number, for example, might be a regular expression, which is common in the IT industry for a way of defining a pattern for what we're looking for. Or we might use something like a keyword or a dictionary as well. So if I wanted to look for an account number, then a regular expression showing what that account number format might look like. Again, if I had a supporting element like a sort code, then that might be either the digits or the digits with hyphens between them to try and make sure that we've got a good match for that, and the proximity, how close those will be together as well. If we were looking at simple keywords like confidential written in a document, then those are very easy to input. We can just write confidential and then match against that. But if, for example, we had a requirement to look for common names, then we might upload dictionaries of common first names, common last names, and match against those when in close proximity. If we were trying to look for an occasion where somebody shared an Excel spreadsheet with a list of names in with an external party. And this is the core of what we'll really do. This used to be quite a complex process where we need to upload an XML file. Now it has this builder that makes it much easier to define what your own data within the organization looks like. Once we've picked or created any custom sensitive information types, the policies for DLP are defined, and they're within the DLP portal. So as I said, we'll be able to use those sensitive information types elsewhere, but these DLP policies are the things that will take effect when data is uploaded and potentially shared internally or externally. So I've got one here that I'll show you in a minute that's already enabled. And this one is fairly straightforward. And what this is going to do, it's focused on Teams because I've got E5 licenses in my tenant, and it is going to affect just Teams messages when content is shared between different people. So if I press on Edit Policy, you'll be able to see the type of options that I can apply for this. So for every DLP policy, we've got a variety of locations that we can pick. So we could choose to apply it to particular accounts or exclude certain accounts if we want to. And we can apply that to services like Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. As I mentioned, you need an E5 license for Teams chat and channel messages. And ideally, you'll pick multiple services for this to take effect against, because If somebody's sharing something in Teams, then it might be actually they're sharing a document over the service as well. So we'll want that policy to apply both to the chat, but also to the documents themselves. Within the rules, we'll get some default rules when we build a template-based policy, but we can create our own custom rules as well, where those lists of conditions that I showed you earlier can be applied. So in this particular policy, this is pulling in a variety of those sensitive information types, such as UK national insurance number, driver's license number, and passport number. I can add some of my existing sensitive information types to that if I want to search against multiple ones. Now, this is why I mentioned if you're using some of the default out-of-the-box templates, then you might find that some of these templates include overlapping areas like for personal information. If we were perhaps trying to do one that covered EU data, one that covered UK data, those might pull in similar sensitive information types. So we need to be conscious that if we just use default policies, then these might match in more places than we might expect, or overlap in terms of their actions, making it very difficult to troubleshoot what happens. For our conditions, then we've got the ability to pick when that is shared in particular places. For example, if we're only trying to match against external sharing, we might add a condition saying when the content is shared, people outside of my organization. And then what we'll do, and in this policy, I've chosen to restrict access and block the content from everybody. And the key part of this is trying to make sure that we're redacting that. So when I go into Teams, if somebody sends a national insurance number across, it's going to block that from everybody to see. And then we've got notifications that we can share with the user. And in this policy that was focused on just Teams, then I'm going to show a tip that'll be shown in the Teams client saying you cannot share this type of PRA using Teams. The user will be able to click in, see that message, and also understand a little bit more about why that was blocked as well. We can also add overrides if we want to allow the person to say, yep, this is fine, and go past it. And then we can add the incident reports into this policy as well. So let's have a quick look at that in action. So I'm going to open up Teams here, and you can see I've asked for a national insurance number. I've been asked for a national insurance number. I'm going to send that across. Just try and make sure I don't enter my own one here. So when I go and send that across over Teams, what happens is this is going to get sent over Teams, but behind the scenes, the policy engine is going to check this and see whether it matches. And you'll see within a couple of seconds, I'll see that the message was blocked, the recipient won't be able to see it, and also I'll see this policy tip that's telling me what happened. So you'll see that message, that custom message that I shared here. You can't share this type of info using Teams, and it also tells me those sensitive information types that triggered the policy to be blocked. And if I want to, I can then go and report that. And of course, as you saw in those other screenshots, this applies whether we're using Outlook. This will apply with OneDrive, depending on whether we've configured the policy to affect that service. So when we're thinking about Office 365 and DLP, then that's usually the focus when we're thinking about the Microsoft technologies and how they can apply these policies. But from a business perspective or a customer, if you're new to Office 365, and your perspective is, well, I want to stop data from being lost. I'm not necessarily concerned just about email or just about Teams. I'm thinking of all the other places where this could accidentally get lost from my organization. And no, I don't want to encrypt all of my data, which will be effective, but it's going to have some other impacts as well. Then conditional access is one of the other tools in the bag that we can use. And what this is doing is sitting in the middle between the device and the service. And it's providing us that ability to decide whether or not somebody can or cannot access the service. So it may be that we'll allow devices that are enrolled with Intune or domain joined, hybrid Azure AD joined devices. They may be allowed into our environment. It might be that will allow devices that are coming from IP addresses that we trust. It might be that we also add some conditions to say if they are from a trusted device, but they're from an untrusted location, then we'll also prompt them for multi-factor authentication. One of the key things to try and enable in almost all organizations. And if you've not got access to Azure AD conditional access, then the security defaults are a good go-to for trying to make sure that you put up some of those barriers to stop access as well. We can also supplement that with session controls, and that's where I'll show you a little bit about Microsoft Cloud App Security in the context of session controls today, where if it is a device that isn't owned by the organization, isn't under our control, then we can add some additional controls on top of that as well. We might say, I want them to be able to come into the organization, but they can only come in through a web browser. And when they do so, I don't want them to download data. I don't want them to copy and paste data. It might be that we only want to protect them from copy and pasting certain data that matches DLP rules defined in Microsoft Cloud App Security as well. It's not foolproof. But for example, you won't be able to stop somebody from screenshotting it, but it's going to give us an additional layer of security that's going to stop people from downloading something to their personal device, and then perhaps if they leave the organization, then they'll still have access to that, even if it's not necessarily sensitive information. So Azure AD Conditional Access, this is a quick demo of what the Microsoft slide shows us. Shows us the type of conditions that we can apply. So we've got our user on the left-hand side here, and we might target that based on the user or the group for different groups of users that'll have policies applied in different ways, perhaps differentiation for your information workers and your first line workers. We'll see with many customers, they may allow offsite access to certain staff, but they might not allow offsite access to people on the first line, temporary workers and so on, that might present a slightly higher risk. And then we can target that based on the applications that they're accessing as well. And this doesn't limit itself to just Office 365. It might be that they're accessing third-party services that you're using some of the Azure SSO functionality for. For example, if you've got integrations with GitHub or Atlassian tools like Jira, Salesforce, services like that, where there's an Azure AD SSO integration, we can create conditional access policies that apply to those as well. So we've got the application they're accessing, but also the device state. Is it up to date and compliant and enrolled in the organization? Is it a device that we manage and is compliant with Intune? Or is it using an application that's managed as well? That could be another condition that ticks our box to allow access. And if it isn't one of those, then what route will we push them into? Many organizations will look at using IP ranges to block access as well. A key one that we'll see with some customers is, again, first line worker scenarios where they're not provided mobile devices. They've only got access perhaps to PCs on the shop floor, and those domain joined devices are not moved out of that location, but they need to be able to access those services without multi-factor authentication being enabled when they're accessing them from those very specific locations. But for most organizations, moving away from people having to come from a certain IP address, VPN into the service, this is something that's definitely recommended, using enrolled devices, multi-factor authentication instead. And then we've got the client application. For example, do we want to block all legacy access to the service from older clients or third-party clients as well? Legacy authentication, is one big risk factor for accessing Office 365 services. It's one of those areas where attackers will be targeting us as well. And blocking legacy authentication is quite common. But it also might be in these kind of scenarios that if somebody is coming through a web browser, then that has a certain set of controls that we will apply using conditional access. And if they're coming from a rich, enlightened application like Office Pro Plus or Microsoft 365 Apps for Business, or an application from the Office suite on the mobile device, or one of those that uses the Intune SDK, then again, we might want to mark that as an OK device as well. And if you've got the ENS E5 licenses or Azure AD Premium Plan 2, then you've got additional options on sign-in risk. So if they are coming from a risky locations determined by Microsoft, then again, that might be an occasion where we need to up level the type of protection or even block access to those services. We get some supplemental controls with Microsoft Cloud App Security, and the session controls here allow us to force the user to go through a reverse proxy service to access Office 365, which is managed and owned by Microsoft. And what this will do is allow us to interrogate what the person's doing and stop that from happening. So if somebody is attempting to copy and paste, or as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, they're attempting to download something from the service, then it's going to stop that from happening in the first place. So let's have a quick demo of how some of these tools work. So I've got a couple of policies in here. So I've got some for managed devices. I've got a browser policy as well. So my managed devices policy is going to be targeted particularly on the rich applications that are on the device. So if somebody's on a managed device, and in my group, I've got my Intune managed users here, and I've selected the preview collection of Office 365 applications, that's another match for that. You'll see in these applications, I can select all cloud apps, which will include everything. Again, things like the portal, the Azure AD service as well that we're accessing at the moment. And we can also be quite granular in the services that we pick. So if we've got third-party integrations, then this is where we'll select those particular applications themselves. For example, if we had, I don't think I've got it on this tenant at the moment, I still do have it. If we've got GitHub, for example, then that might be something that we also want these policies to apply for as well. My conditions on this are fairly straightforward. I've got my device platform. This is going to be targeted against Windows devices in particular. And I've got my client applications where I've got the desktop clients, including modern authentication applications. And this is quite straightforward. For purposes of the demo, I'm just going to require that device to be marked as compliant. So that's going to allow access using the Office applications from a Windows 10 PC that's enrolled within the organization. Then I've got a second policy here that's focused particularly on if somebody's accessing this through the browser. This is where Cloud App Security is going to come in, where again, I've picked my cloud apps. I've got this preview collection of Office 365 services, and I've got some conditions. This is again targeted at Windows users, but targeted at the browser itself. And in this set of controls, then I am going to require multi-factor authentication, and the device should be compliant as well. So I need one of these two controls. And if one of those is met, then we're going to allow access. So this will be targeting my home users, but also targeting my managed desktops as well. And if somebody hits this policy with a browser, then I've got a choice of built-in policies here, so monitor only or block downloads, or to use a custom policy. And if I go over to the custom policies, then go into the Cloud App Security portal, then that's going to give me these policies for session controls. And I've configured a session control policy in here. So let's have a look at policies. Select type, session policy. And I've got two here, one block download from unmanaged devices, another block copy and paste on unmanaged devices. And these are both very similar in what they do and what they check against. So I'll show you just this one here where I've named it block download from unmanaged devices, and I've picked from the session control type, control file download with inspection. I'm not using DLP on top of this to monitor the content. I want to block everything, but I only want this to apply if the device tag is not Intune compliant. So this will only kick into effect and force them through the session controls. It will only reverse proxy them into the service from a web browser if they're not an enrolled device. So this is going to allow me to cover those as home devices. So if I go and attempt this, I'm going to attempt to log in to portal.office.com. And I'll log in as one of my users, Steve Test. steveg.org. And I should end up getting a request on my phone. I approve my sign in. I'm allowed in. This will stay signed in, even though I'm in a private browser. And everything looks pretty normal so far. And I'm going to go into SharePoint. So I'm going to have a look at this episode here of the All About 365 podcast. And you'll see at the top, this has changed the URL ever so slightly as it's going through Cloud App Security. So the URL remains very similar, except for this us.cas.ms. And if I then go and attempt to download this, this is where the policy should kick in, where it says the download is blocked by the organization's security policy. And we should see similar for copy and paste as well, action blocked. So very simple controls, but it means that we've got that extra layer of security that's aimed at protecting against access to the organization. So the third pillar in this is how we can use the app protection capabilities. And first of all, we'll have a look at how these can apply on mobile. So our mobile devices are other things that can end up anywhere. And if you're using mobile devices that's you'll use as personal devices, then this can be a big risk at the moment. There's a lot of scenarios where people might let their kids use the device. They might be left in a place where somebody else is going to access it. And as I said earlier, there might be applications on the device that are nefarious and looking to try and extract data. And this can make it much easier to protect how and where the data can or can't be shared with. It allows us to containerize the application, even if we don't enroll the device itself. Enrolling the device in the Android enterprise model or the same with iOS devices is good. It gives you full control over the entire device, what people can do on it. But there's a lot of scenarios where people will just install the applications that they need and want access to the service. And this containerization using Intune App Protection, the MAM or Mobile Application Management Policies, allow us to define what can happen within the boundaries of the applications themselves, and also where the boundaries are for those applications. So a user can simply install the application from the App Store, log in with their Office 365 credential, and if they're allowed access to the services, as you already Conditional Access Policies have said, yep, they're in, then these MAM policies, the app protection policies, will apply to the data that's owned by the organization, and they can continue to access the services. And effectively, what that's giving us is that familiar Office experience where they've got the normal applications, they might already be using them for their personal data, but we can split the two off so that the corporate data always follows our rules, and we can decide where that can and can't go within the device itself. We can also make sure that the data remains protected, and we can make sure that when somebody's accessing our company's data, even if it's their own device, even if they've not enrolled it, then they might have to use biometrics or enter a PIN before they can access company information. We can make sure that they can't copy and paste that data outside of the application itself. I'll show you this demo quickly using screenshots rather than projecting my mobile device, because sometimes that doesn't work when it's a protected application and I'm trying to share the screen. But I'll quickly show you this here. And you'll see if I attempt to send that data outside of an app, what will happen is pretty simple. If I paste that data, for example, into the Notes application from a Teams chat, from a Word document, however big that is, that buffer that should be stored in the clipboard won't be accessible to other applications. When a user attempts to paste that into another app, like I'm attempting to do here, into the built-in Notes application on my Samsung device, then this is just going to block that, and the user will see a message saying your organization's data cannot be pasted here. And through the policies that we can configure in the service, we can govern what should or shouldn't happen. So I'll jump back into the portal here, and inside the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, I'll go into Endpoint Manager, where we can go in and configure our Intune App Protection policies. So inside my app protection policies, I'll have a look and creating a new one, and I'll create one particularly for Android devices here, and just call this test Android policy. Target that for all applications, and we can pick the applications that that's going to affect. So for simplicity's sake, let's just pick Microsoft Teams. I'll go through this, and this is where we can govern what will or won't happen. So if we want to stop them from blocking backups of data, then we can. If we want to try and make sure that the data itself is going to be encrypted on the device, we can. And in particular, we can see whether organization data can be sent between different applications or not. And the clever thing about this is it's going to allow us to allow data to be sent between and copy and pasted between the policy managed applications. So if we want to, we can say, right, well, we will allow data in from all apps, or perhaps we'll allow all apps to allow it, or we might say our boundaries are the policy managed apps. The two shall never meet, and policy managed apps are going to be allowed all of the way. We can block things like screen capture or Google Assistant from seeing it. We can only allow certain required keyboards if we have the strings for those. If you want to say only particular keyboards are going to be allowed, for example, Microsoft own Swift key, or perhaps we do trust built-in Samsung keyboards, the Google keyboards, then we'll allow those as approved keyboards as well. But we don't necessarily want a user to go and install their own keyboard that might pull data out of the service as well. We can require the data to be encrypted within the application itself. We can allow or block synchronization of things like organizational contacts, and we can also stop things like printing of data as well. It's very easy these days to allow somebody to print out of an application into a home printer. We can allow or block that depending on what we want to happen. So we've got a great set of features that we can enable there. The last one I wanted to show you before we wrap up today is the Windows Information Protection functionality. And this is giving us our final piece where what we're not looking at doing is blocking data with MIP in this use case, but we want to stop somebody from sharing that data, whether or not it's sensitive to the organization. We want to control where our data lives. And this fits really sort of in the middle here, where AIP, the full sensitive information protection, is sitting on the right-hand side. DLP is covering making sure that data can't be shared outside of the organization. This is sitting similar to the app protection functionality on mobile, where we're containing that corporate data. So I'm just going to go back into my demo here, and I've got an app protection policy set up for Windows devices that's applied. And you'll see this is fairly straightforward. We've defined what the corporate identity looks like and our network perimeter as well. So the domains that are part of our tenant. So we know where people will be accessing the service from, what our organization settings are. There's a list from Microsoft showing what these look like. And then we can define what will happen. And I want to be able to make sure people know it's a corporate application, but I'm not going to be applying Azure RMS for the data. I just want to try and make sure that the data doesn't go too far. So on my demo machine here, you'll see that when this is applied, then quite simply, all of the data, for example, if it's been synchronized locally using the OneDrive client, shared OneDrive library, will show the file ownership of that data, which means that even if I move it around the device, so I'll pop that into downloads, then we still can track that's the organization's data. We'll keep that tag attached to it. So if I go to, let's have a look for a file upload service.
Sorry, Steve, we're nearly reaching the end.
Yep. If we go to an anonymous file upload service, then we won't be able to upload to that without, let's have a look, anon files. We won't be able to upload to that using the managed browsers. What this will restrict us to is what browsers, how users can access the internet. But you'll see what we can't do is move our data to the wrong location. So if I attempt to upload a file, even if I've moved it around the device, then it won't allow us to upload that to third-party services. So what this is giving us is the ability to protect at a high level all of our content, whether it is sensitive enough to be encrypted or not, and make sure that we've got a level of control, whether they're accessing from a personal device, mobile device, or even a corporate managed device that's outside of your control as well, but also trying to control where they can and can't share that with using the DLP functionality that's core to Office 365 itself. So we're wrapping up the session now. I'm going to jump over to the breakout session if you follow that link for any Q&A. So please do join us for that. If you've got any questions that you want answered, I'll be hanging around there for 10 minutes or so in between now and your next session. Thank you very much for joining me today. I've been Steve Goodman.
All right, thank you, Steve. I have posted the link for the breakout session in the chat, so you can catch up Steve over there. Thank you, everyone.